The sun was a hammer and the dust was the anvil, and she was the piece of bent metal being beaten between them. She stood tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town. A single street of false-fronted buildings that leaned into each other like tired drunks. Her feet, bare and bruised, were planted in the ochre dirt. The skin cracked like old clay. The rope was coarse against her wrists, a familiar bite. It was the same rope that had bound her to the back of the wagon for 3 days. Clinging to the frayed cloth of her skirt was the child, a small, silent creature with eyes too old for her face. The girl's hair was a tangle of straw, her face smudged with dirt, and the faint, sticky residue of tears cried out long ago. She did not make a sound. She only held on, her tiny knuckles white, a limpet on a rock in a merciless tide. The woman kept her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the town, where the heat made the horizon shimmer and the flat land stretched into a bleached infinity. She did not look at the faces that passed, the faces of men who appraised her like livestock, their eyes lingering on her form, calculating worth and use, the faces of women who stared from the shaded boardwalks, their lips thin lines of judgment, their whispers like the dry skittering of insects. A man named Brant circled her, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He was the one who had tied her here. He was a man made of sour sweat and cheap whiskey, his voice a gravelly boast. He gestured toward her with a sweep of his arm, addressing the thin crowd of loafers and merchants. "Sturdy," he announced, his voice oiled with false confidence. "Good for work. Quiet too. Comes with the whelp. No extra charge." A few men laughed, a hollow, ugly sound that the wind snatched and tore apart. The woman did not flinch. Her stillness was a shield, thin as glass but all she had. Inside, a cold, hard knot had taken the place of whatever used to be there. Hope had been burned out of her, leaving only a hard, smooth scar where it had been. She was an object, an item to be disposed of. The child pressed her face deeper into her mother's leg, a small, warm weight in a world gone cold. The sun climbed higher, relentless. The crowd grew bored. Their interest, never more than a flicker, began to wane. They drifted away, back to the saloon, back to the shade of the general store. The whispers faded. Soon, it was just her, the child, and Brant, who was growing angrier with every passing minute. His investment was souring in the heat. She felt a change in the air before she saw it. A shadow fell over her, longer and cooler than the ones cast by the buildings. From the edge of town, a man walked toward them. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, as if he were measuring the earth with each step. He was tall and thin as a fence rail, wrapped in a long, dust-colored coat despite the heat. His face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and something deeper, something that lived behind his eyes. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He had come from the east on foot, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a quiet that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. The men on the boardwalk watched him, noting the way he walked, the set of his shoulders. They had seen men like him before, men spat out from the territorial prison with all the softness scoured out of them. He stopped a dozen feet from the post, his gaze not on her, but on Brant. Brant puffed out his chest, smelling a potential customer. "See something you like, friend? She's a bargain." The man's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, finally moved to her. It was not the assessing stare of the others. It was a long, steady look, devoid of heat or judgment. It was the look of a man seeing a fence that needed mending or a field that needed plowing. He saw a thing that was broken. His gaze dropped to the child, who peered out at him from behind the shield of her mother's skirt. For a flicker of a second, something shifted in the man's hard face, a brief thaw in the permafrost. He looked back at Brant. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy, like it came from under floorboards. "How much?" Brant's eyes gleamed with greed. He named a price that was an insult, a sum for a good horse, not a discarded woman and child. The stranger didn't haggle. He reached inside his worn coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and emptied its contents onto the top of a rain barrel nearby. A handful of coins, dull and worn, clattered on the wood. It was not the price Brant had asked, but it was clearly all the man had. "It'll settle the debt," the stranger said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Brant looked from the coins to the man. He saw the cold resolve in the man's eyes, the utter lack of fear. He saw the way the man's hands, calloused and scarred, rested near his belt. Brant was a blusterer, not a fighter. He licked his lips, his greed warring with his cowardice. He glanced around. The town was watching again, but from a distance. There would be no help for him here. "Food for work," the stranger stated, his voice flat. Nothing more. He was speaking to her now, though he still looked at Brant. It was a promise and a boundary, laid down as clear as a line in the dust. Brant hesitated, then grumbled and scooped the coins off the barrel. "She's your problem now," he spat and turned his back, stalking toward the saloon without a backward glance. The silence that followed was heavy and vast. The woman watched the stranger. He walked to the post, his movements economical, without hurry. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his coat. The blade clicked open, a sharp, clean sound in the oppressive heat. He did not look at her face. He looked at the rope on her wrists. With 2 quick, efficient cuts, he severed the bindings. The rope fell away. She rubbed her wrists, the skin raw and chafed, the feeling of freedom so alien it was painful. She did not speak. He folded the knife and slipped it back into his pocket, maintaining his distance. He gave a slight nod toward the edge of town, the direction from which he had come. Then he turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she would follow. For a long moment, she remained by the post, a statue freed from its pedestal. The child looked up at her, her small face a question. The woman took a breath, the air thick with dust and the smell of defeat. Then she took the child's hand. Her own was trembling. One step, then another. She followed the man's retreating back, a tall, lonely figure moving toward the shimmering, empty horizon. They left the town behind them, the dust lifting from their feet like the ghosts of who they used to be. The journey was a silent one. The man, Silas, walked ahead, his long strides eating up the dry, cracked earth. He did not set a punishing pace. He seemed to be aware of the small legs of the child trudging beside her, and the drag in her own steps. The sun beat down, and the world was reduced to the crunch of their feet on the parched ground and the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. After an hour, he stopped. He unhooked a canteen from his belt and held it out to her, his eyes on the horizon. She hesitated, her throat a desert. It was the first gesture of kindness she had received in so long. It felt like a trick. The child, however, whimpered softly, a sound of pure need. That decided it. She took the canteen, the metal warm from the sun. She knelt and gave the child a drink first, tilting it carefully to her lips. Then she drank herself, the water tasting of metal and life. She handed it back, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. It felt like a spark of static electricity. He took it and walked on. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the landscape unchanging. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the jagged line of distant hills, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, a shape emerged from the emptiness. A small cabin, built of weathered, silvered wood, with a sod roof and a stone chimney. It stood alone, a solitary outpost against the vastness, with a leaning fence and a small, wind-battered barn. On a low hill behind the house, a single wooden cross stood stark against the sky. The place had the feel of a wound that had never quite healed. It was a reflection of the man who led them there. Isolated, weathered, functional but unadorned, haunted by a loss that was as plain as the grave on the hill. Silas did not pause at the door. He pushed it open and stepped inside, leaving it open for her. The interior was dark and cool. It smelled of wood smoke, dust, and old sorrow. A single room served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made, a faded quilt pulled tight over it. Everything was spare, clean, and crushingly lonely. She and the child hovered in the doorway, framed by the dying light, uncertain. Silas moved through the gloom with familiarity. He lit a kerosene lamp on the table, and the small, flickering flame pushed back the shadows, revealing a second, smaller room off to the side. His door was closed. He gestured toward his own bed in the corner. "You and the girl," he said, his voice quiet in the confines of the cabin. "It's safe." He then walked to the hearth, laid a fire with practiced hands, and struck a match. The kindling caught, and a small, hungry flame began to lick at the logs. The sound of the crackling wood was the first welcoming noise the house had made. He did not say more. He took a blanket from a chest at the foot of his bed, her bed now, and carried it to the far side of the main room near the hearth. He laid it on the floorboards. That would be his place. He had established the rules without a single command. He had given her the safest space. He had provided warmth. He respected the invisible wall between them. She finally moved from the doorway, pulling the child with her. She looked at the closed door of the small side room, a question in her eyes. Silas saw her look. "That was my wife's," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "The door stays shut." He turned his back to them then, busying himself at the hearth, his message clear. A part of this house, like a part of him, was sealed off. She guided the child to the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress. It was firm, the quilt rough under her hands. He moved to a small pantry, brought out a slab of bacon, half a loaf of bread, and a sack of beans. He began to cook, his movements efficient. He did not speak to her again. He was setting up the unspoken contract. He would provide shelter, food, warmth. He would not lock the doors. In return, she was expected to work, and to be silent. It was a language she understood perfectly. The smell of frying bacon filled the small cabin, a scent so ordinary, so domestic. It was deeply, achingly strange. The child, exhausted, laid her head in her mother's lap and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The days settled into a rhythm, marked not by conversation but by the sun's arc across the sky and the shared, silent labor. Their lives became a quiet choreography of necessity. Silas rose before dawn, his movements spare as he rekindled the fire and put coffee on to boil. She would wake to the smell and the low crackle of the flames, the child still breathing softly beside her. She took over the cooking without a word being exchanged. The first breakfast she made was a disaster of burnt bacon and coffee thick as mud. Silas ate it without complaint, his face impassive. When he was done, he simply pushed his plate back and went outside. She found the scorched pan scrubbed clean and left by the water basin later that day. The next morning, the bacon was crisp and the coffee was clear. He glanced at her as he took the first sip, a barely perceptible nod. It was a conversation. He worked the land with a grim determination, mending the leaning fences that enclosed a small, fallow field. His hammer blows a steady, percussive beat against the silence. She watched him from the cabin door, a tall, solitary figure wrestling with a stubborn world. She found a purpose inside the cabin's 4 walls. She swept the floors until the wood planks showed their grain. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth. She took his torn shirts and stitched them with thread she found in a dusty sewing box, her stitches small and neat. She was stitching their lives together with raw thread, trying to make something whole out of broken pieces. The child, whose name was Sarah, was a bridge. At first, she stayed glued to her mother's side, a silent shadow. Then her curiosity began to win out over her fear. She would sit on the cabin steps and watch Silas as he sharpened an axe or repaired a leather harness. He never acknowledged her directly, but one afternoon, he left a small, crudely carved bird on the top step where she always sat. She found it, her eyes wide. She clutched it in her small hand for the rest of the day, a talisman against the world's sharp edges. One morning, while weeding the small, stubborn vegetable patch near the house, she looked up toward the hill. She saw the stark wooden cross, lonely against the big sky. Later that day, she walked up there, Sarah's hand in hers. The earth over the grave was hard-packed, a few wild weeds clinging to it. The name Anna was carved into the cross. She pulled the weeds, her fingers digging into the dry soil. She found a single, tough prairie wildflower, a splash of defiant yellow, and laid it at the base of the cross. When she came back down, Silas was standing by the barn, watching her. He did not speak, but his gaze followed her all the way back to the house. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It was full of things unsaid. A rider from the town, a man with curious eyes and a loose tongue, stopped by one afternoon on the pretext of asking for water. He let his gaze linger on her as she worked in the garden. "Heard Silas got himself some help?" the man said, a smirk playing on his lips. Fresh out of prison and already talking in strays. Before she could retreat into the cabin, Silas was there. He moved from the barn to the well in a few long strides, placing himself between her and the rider. He filled a dipper with water and handed it to the man, his body a solid wall. "She's not a stray," Silas said, his voice level and cold as creek water. "And my business is my own." The rider drank the water quickly, intimidated by the quiet force of the man. He mumbled his thanks and rode off, glancing back once over his shoulder. Silas stood there until the rider was just a speck of dust on the horizon. He did not look at her, but she felt the protection of his gesture wrap around her like a shawl. That night, the past came for her in her sleep. A nightmare, visceral and suffocating, of ropes and leering faces and Brant's sour breath. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was pitch black, the fire burned down to embers. A floorboard creaked in the main room. He was awake. He had heard her. She held her breath, expecting him to come to the door to speak. But he did not. There was only silence, and the knowledge that he was there, listening in the dark. She was afraid he would think her weak. She was afraid of the pity she was sure she would see in his eyes in the morning. But the next day he behaved as if nothing had happened. He ate his breakfast, his gaze on his plate. He went out to the fields. The routine was unbroken. That evening, however, when he lit the lamp, he did not put it on the main table. He placed it on a small crate just outside her doorway, the wick turned down low. It cast a gentle, steady glow that held the deepest shadows at bay. It was an answer. It was an understanding. It was a light in the dark. She sat by the fire with him that night, mending one of Sarah's dresses. The child was asleep on the bed. The only sounds were the crackling of the logs and the whisper of her needle through the cloth. The silence felt comfortable now, a shared blanket. "Why?" she asked, her voice thin from disuse. It was the first question she had ever asked him. He looked up from the piece of leather he was oiling, his hands still. He knew what she was asking. Why her? Why them? He stared into the fire for a long moment, the flames dancing in his haunted eyes. "I was in prison a long time," he said, his voice low. "I saw enough of men like Brant. Men who think the world owes them, who take and take until there's nothing left." He looked at his own scarred hands. "I saw what it does to people," he paused. No one should have to stand on a block. It was more than she had ever heard him say. It was a piece of his own brokenness, offered up in the firelight. She nodded, her throat tight. She understood. He hadn't rescued her out of charity. He had done it out of a deep, painful recognition. He was just as much a stray as she was. They were two pieces of wreckage washed up on the same lonely shore, trying to build a shelter before the tide came in again. The first sign of trouble was a change in the wind. It seemed to carry a different sound, a tension that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Then, one afternoon, she saw it. A faint plume of dust on the far eastern horizon, too deliberate for a dust devil, too steady for a lone rider. It was a group of men moving with purpose. She stood by the fence, her hand shading her eyes, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She knew who it was. The past had a long memory and a relentless stride. Silas came to stand beside her, drawn by her stillness. He followed her gaze to the horizon, and his face hardened, the brief softness of recent weeks vanishing like a puddle in the sun. He did not need to ask. He knew too. "Get in the house," he said, his voice tight. "Take the girl. Stay away from the window." She did as he said, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She pulled Sarah, who was playing by the steps, into the cabin and latched the door. She peered through a small crack in the wallboards. She could see Silas walk to the barn. He emerged a moment later, not with the rifle she expected, but with a heavy axe handle which he leaned against the porch rail. Then he simply stood on the porch, his arms crossed, waiting. He looked small against the vastness of the land, one man against the approaching storm. It took nearly an hour for the riders to arrive. There were 3 of them, led by Brant. He sat on his horse with a smug, proprietary air, his eyes sweeping over the homestead. He saw the mended fence, the neat woodpile, the smoke curling from the chimney. He saw the signs of life, of care, and his face twisted with a covetous resentment. He was not here to reclaim a burden. He was here to reclaim an asset that had appreciated in value. "Silas?" Brant called out, his voice carrying an oily familiarity. "I've come for my property." Silas did not move. "She's not your property," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the still air. "A deal was made." "A pittance?" Brant sneered, spitting into the dust. "You cheated me. She was security on a debt, and that debt ain't settled. The judge in the next county agrees. I got papers." He patted a rolled-up document tucked into his saddlebag. "She belongs to me, legally." The argument was a perversion of order, a twisting of rules to serve cruelty. It was a language the world understood far better than the quiet contract of decency Silas had forged. This confrontation was not taking place in a lawless vacuum. It was taking place on his land, her home, turning the soil they had both worked into a battleground. "The paper don't matter," Silas said, his gaze as steady as stone. "This is her home now. You're not taking her." Brant laughed, a short, ugly bark. He looked at his 2 hired men, who shifted in their saddles, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. "I don't think you're in a position to argue, convict. It's 3 against 1 inch." He swung down from his horse. "Now send her out. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." Inside, she trembled, holding Sarah tight against her. The child was whimpering, sensing the terror that radiated from her mother. For a moment, all the old helplessness washed over her. She was an object again, a piece of property to be fought over and claimed. The walls of the cabin felt like a cage. But then she looked at the door. On the other side of that thin wood was a man standing alone for her. A man who had offered her a bed, a light in the dark, and the silent gift of respect. He had asked for nothing. He had stood between her and the world. The fire he had built in the hearth had burned away more than just the evening chill. It had burned away the frost that had encased her heart. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. She let go of Sarah. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice fierce. She unlatched the door and stepped out onto the porch. The sudden sunlight was blinding. Brant's smirk widened when he saw her. "There she is. Be a good girl now and come along. Don't cause your new master any more trouble." Silas moved to block her, to put himself in front of her again, but she put a hand on his arm. A touch, the first she had ever initiated. He stopped, surprised, and looked at her. He saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. The hunted look was gone. In its place was a cold, hard fire. She stepped past him to the edge of the porch so she was looking down at Brant. She was no longer an object. She was a woman standing on the threshold of her own home. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the air with the sharp edge of a shard of glass. Brant's smirk faltered. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "This is my home." "He is not my master," she looked at Silas. "This is my family." At that moment, the cabin door creaked open again. Sarah, terrified of being left alone, ran out onto the porch. She didn't go to her mother. She ran straight to Silas and wrapped her small arms around his leg, hiding her face against the rough denim. It was a definitive, damning declaration. In the eyes of the child, this was the man who was father, who was safety. The image of the three of them, the defiant woman, the unyielding man, and the child clinging to him, formed a tableau of unity that Brant could not break. His claim of property, of legal right, seemed flimsy and obscene in the face of it. He stared, his face turning an ugly, mottled red. His authority was built on the assumption of her silent compliance. Her defiance, her claim to a life and a family, had stolen his power. "You'll regret this," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He was a bully, and bullies thrive on fear. There was no fear on the porch, only a resolve as hard as the prairie earth. He looked at his men, but they were looking at Silas, at the axe handle that was now in his hand, at the woman with fire in her eyes. They were hired for a repossession, not a war against a family on their own land. Brant hesitated, then spat on the ground one last time. He climbed back onto his horse, his movements clumsy with rage. "This ain't over," he vowed. But he turned his horse around. His men followed, relieved. They rode away, their retreat kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly back onto the quiet land. She stood on the porch, watching them go until they were gone. Her body was shaking with the aftermath of courage. Silas had not moved from his spot, the child still clinging to his leg. The heavy axe handle was loose in his grip. When the dust had settled, he finally looked at her. A long, quiet look that held more than 1,000 words of gratitude or praise. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently rest his hand on Sarah's head, a gesture of profound, paternal tenderness. That evening, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter. They ate their meal in a silence that was no longer a negotiation of space but a shared state of grace. After, as she sat mending, she looked across the flickering light at him. "I was scared," she said softly. He looked up from his work, his eyes meeting hers across the small room. "I know," he said. "You didn't run." There was nothing more to say. He had seen her fear, and he had seen her strength. And she had seen his. They were no longer two separate, broken people. They were a single, unified front. The house around them seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its lonely corners now filled with the warmth of a hard-won peace. The days that followed were different. The threat had been met and turned away, and in its place, a new certainty had taken root. The unspoken contract of food for work had been torn up, burned in the fire of that confrontation. A new one was being written, one of shared futures and fragile hope. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky, he turned to her. Sarah was asleep inside, clutching the small wooden bird he had carved. "I don't know your name," he said. It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of all the months they had lived together. He had never asked, had never presumed that right. She looked out at the vast, dark land, at the horizon where her old life had vanished and this new one had begun. She had been a piece of property, a stray, a nameless woman. To give her name was to claim herself. "It's Lena," she said, her voice clear and steady. He tried the name out, his own voice low and careful, as if handling something precious. "Lena." It settled in the air between them, solid and real. He had not just asked for her name, he had asked for her. "It's a good name." From that day on, he used it. He would call for her from the field, "Lena," and the sound of her own name in his mouth was a kind of homecoming. A week later, he came in from the barn holding something in his hand. It was a small doll, fashioned from scraps of leather and a twist of corn silk for hair. The stitches were clumsy, thick, but it was made with an undeniable care. He didn't give it to her. He walked over to the bed where Sarah slept and gently tucked it beside her. A gift from a father. The house began to change. Lena found a small box of her own, a remnant of Anna's life, that held curtains of a pale, faded blue. She washed them and hung them in the window. The stark cabin was softened by the color. The harsh afternoon light filtered into something gentle. It was a small act, but it was an act of permanence. Said, I am here. I am staying. One afternoon, they worked together to rebuild a section of the barn wall that had been damaged in a winter storm long past. They moved in tandem, him lifting the heavy new planks, her holding them steady while he hammered the nails home. The rhythmic work, the shared goal, was its own kind of conversation. When they were finished, they stood back, side by side, covered in sawdust, looking at the solid, repaired wall. He gestured to the neat line of nails. A little crooked. A smile touched her lips, a rare and beautiful thing. You didn't complain about my biscuits this morning. He almost smiled back. The corner of his mouth twitched. They were a little dry. It was the closest they had ever come to a joke. A small, perfect moment of lightness in their sober world. It felt like the first green shoot pushing through hard, frozen ground. That autumn, he took the wagon into town for the first time since the day he had found them. She worried, watching him go, afraid the town's poison would seep back into him. But when he returned, his face was calm. He had bought sacks of flour and sugar, a bolt of warm wool cloth, and a small bag of hard candy for Sarah. He had faced the whispers and the stares and had returned to his home. The final piece fell into place on a cold evening, with the first hint of snow in the wind. The three of them were huddled by the fire. Sarah, sleepy, was leaning against Silas's side. She looked from Lena to him, her small face serious. Then she pointed a finger at him. Papa, she said. The word was clear, unwavering. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Silas went completely still, as if the child's word had turned him to stone. He looked down at the top of Sarah's head, then across the fire at Lena. His eyes, those stormy, haunted eyes, were filled with a profound, aching vulnerability. He had been given a name, too. He didn't speak. He simply reached out his arm and pulled the child more securely against his side, enclosing her in his warmth. He held her there, his gaze locked with Lena's. In that look, a promise was made and accepted. A hasty marriage of paper and ink could not have been more binding. The old life of grief was over. The house was no longer a hollow place of loss. It was full. It breathed. They were a family, forged not by law or blood, but by the quiet, fierce gravity of shared survival. They sat there for a long time, the fire crackling, the wind howling outside, the three of them a small, warm island in the vast, cold dark. This story, it isn't just about a man saving a woman from a bad spot. It's not that simple. It's about two people who were thrown away by the world, left for scrap, who found each other in the dust and the silence. It's a story about how real strength isn't in the fist or the loud voice, but in the quiet resolve to stand for something, to build something. It's about the profound kindness that can exist in the harshest of places. The kindness of a shared meal, a warm blanket, a light left burning in the dark. It's about how sometimes the most important words we ever hear are our own names, spoken with respect by someone who sees us not for what we were, but for who we are. So here's your naming. For every time you've felt like an object on a block, for every time you've been defined by your scars instead of your strength, for every time you've stood your ground when it was easier to run. This story is your name, spoken with respect. Because out there, in the quiet, lonely places of your own life, there is a hearth waiting to be lit. There is a broken fence waiting for a patient hand. And if you are very brave and very quiet, you might just find that you are not building a shelter for one, but a home for two or for three. You might just find that the family you build is stronger than the one you lost.